Why are there so many predatory relationships in the entertainment industry? Whether it's the famous rock star who openly dated a 14-year-old, the middle-aged Oscar winner who can't seem to find a date over the age of 25, or the actor who found a legal loophole that allowed him to marry a 16-year-old, we're so accustomed to seeing adult celebrities get away with the exploitation of adolescents that the seriousness of the issue has been reduced to a throwaway punchline. Hollywood is known for being a place where predatory behavior is allowed to thrive. Just look at Harvey Weinstein. But the press and the public are equally responsible for allowing this vicious cycle to continue, glossing over the issue even when presented with decades worth of evidence of its harmful effects. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the entertainment industry's history of brushing predatory relationships under the rug. We're going to be talking about the various celebrities who have a penchant for pursuing much younger partners, the scientific reasons as to why age isn't just a number, the sexualization and manipulation of minors, the exploitation of the justice system, and most importantly, why we all have a responsibility to stop this from continuing to happen. Just as a warning, there will be mentions of child abuse, domestic violence, manipulation techniques, and sexual assault. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's get into it. A time of economic prosperity, the Roaring Twenties is fondly remembered for revolutionizing music, art, and fashion in the United States, with the jazz movement flourishing, the Art Deco style reaching its peak, and hemlines shortening to represent women's newfound freedoms. The film industry was absolutely booming during this period of time, with English comic actor and filmmaker Charlie Chaplin rising to fame, and becoming one of the most well-known faces of the silent film era, at least as long as he had his mustache. Although his films brought him critical and commercial success, his personal life was wrought with controversy. Early on in his career, Chaplin became known for his habit of dating underage girls, getting them pregnant, and then subsequently marrying them to bypass legal consequences. The first of his teen wives was actress Mildred Harris, who Chaplin met at a party in 1918 when she was 16 and he was nearly 30. Shortly after getting together, Harris told Chaplin that she was pregnant, and he swiftly arranged for them to be married to avoid scandal and criminal charges, as a baby was proof that he had had sexual relations with a minor. Despite people often claiming that things were different back then, the age of consent in California was already 18 by that point in time, and teen marriages weren't as common as you would think. Chaplin got around the sticky situation by exploiting one of the many legal loopholes in the US justice system that allowed adults to marry minors, which includes a parent or judge providing consent, or the underage person becoming pregnant by said adult, strategies which are still employed by predators today. Harris's pregnancy turned out to be a false alarm, and Chaplin started to believe that she had tricked him into marrying her, which soured their relationship, with Chaplin frequently criticizing her acting abilities and intelligence. The latter criticism is rather duplicitous because from the very beginning, he and Harris weren't intellectual equals, which for many predators is actually the main appeal, with Elizabeth Shaw, a clinical and counseling psychologist, saying, quote, "At their worst, an age gap relationship can be a predatory relationship where the investment doesn't come from a clean place. It's like, I've got this much younger person who I can mold who might be under my thumb a bit, and in fact, I can direct what they do. Their vulnerability developmentally can mean I have more power over them." Although the US government considers anyone over the age of 18 a legal adult, science doesn't agree. Numerous studies have shown that the human brain doesn't reach full development until your mid to late 20s, with the prefrontal cortex being one of the last parts to mature. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for a multitude of complex functions including impulse control, future planning, attention, communication, fear modulation, empathy, insight, moral awareness, and intuition. Because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed before the age of 25, people younger than that process information with their amygdala, which is more emotional than logical. Obviously, that doesn't mean that every single decision a teenager makes is illogical and invalid, but it does mean that adults have a responsibility to help them make informed choices that won't cause lasting harm. Regardless of what the law deems legal, if an adult knowingly enters a relationship with an adolescent, they are exploiting their immaturity and inexperience, while also putting the younger person in a situation where they can be easily manipulated. Besides Chaplin being significantly older than his young bride, which already put Harris at a disadvantage, his influence within the industry further solidified the power imbalance in their relationship. Even though she had first begun acting as a child, following their marriage, the media began referring to her exclusively as Mrs. Charlie Chaplin, reducing her to nothing more than his wife, which thereby made her dependent on him in order to ensure that the fickle business didn't turn on her. Harris did eventually become pregnant, but the child died 3 days after being born in 1919 due to health complications. This, combined with Chaplin's rampant mistreatment and neglect, led to her having a nervous breakdown at age 18, and in 1920 she filed for divorce from the actor based on mental cruelty. Without wasting any time, Chaplin set his sights on another young actress, Lida Gray, who he had first met on the set of the 1921 film The Kid, when she was only 12 years old.
And Charlie looked at me and he said, "Oh yes, and she's very pretty. Now, would you like to be in a movie?" Well, I said I'd have to ask my mother.
Chaplin allegedly commissioned a friend to paint a portrait of her because he was so taken by her beauty, but he would wait several years before attempting a serious relationship with Gray. While auditioning brunettes for the lead role in his 1925 film The Gold Rush, the two reunited. And now deeming her to be a more appropriate age, 35-year-old Charlie Chaplin began an affair with the then 15-year-old. Soon becoming pregnant, resulting in her role being recast in the film, Chaplin quickly married Gray in secret in order to avoid potential imprisonment for having sexual relations with a minor. As the exact same strategy he'd used years earlier with Mildred Harris, it was clear that this was becoming Chaplin's MO. The couple's marriage was troubled from the start, unsurprisingly so considering their 20-year age gap. And despite having 2 children together, Chaplin spent less and less time at home and more time with his mistresses. Gray eventually filed for divorce, which became a media sensation thanks to Chaplin's celebrity. And to the press, the actor claimed that 19-year-old Gray had engaged in numerous affairs, was a neglectful parent, and a generally bad wife. The public wholeheartedly accepted this narrative, with Lida Gray's own father placing little blame on his son-in-law, instead saying that Gray was deserving of punishment. Quote, "If what I see in the papers is true, 15 minutes in the woodshed, with Lida receiving attention from the business end of a shingle, would prove very beneficial to her." However, those with intimate knowledge of Chaplin's behavior, like ex-wife Mildred Harris, attributed his relationship troubles to his penchant for young girls, saying in an interview in 1926, quote, "It isn't strange that Lida couldn't understand Charlie. I doubt if any young girl could understand Charlie Chaplin. I know that I didn't." Following this divorce, Chaplin entered a relationship with 22-year-old actress Paulette Goddard. Although she was a good deal older than his previous teen brides, marking a slight improvement, when the couple met in 1932, Chaplin was already 43 years old, nearly twice Goddard's age. Believed to have gotten married sometime in 1936, this relationship fared a bit better than his prior ones, and the two remained friendly even after their divorce in 1942. Around this time, Chaplin was embroiled in a series of legal battles that significantly affected his public image, including a paternity suit filed by 21-year-old actress Joan Barry, who Chaplin had had an affair with in 1941. The media's overwhelmingly negative coverage of the trial is said to have been influenced by the FBI, who were leading a smear campaign to damage Chaplin's image because of his political views. The controversy surrounding Chaplin further increased when 2 weeks after the paternity suit was filed, he announced that he had married his newest protege, 18-year-old Una O'Neill. Although her mother had given the union her blessing, her father, playwright Eugene O'Neill, publicly denounced the relationship, making him one of the only parents of Chaplin's teen brides to do so. However, his anger appeared to be aimed at Una instead of Chaplin, who at 54 years old was the same age as his new father-in-law. And Eugene would eventually disown Una and refuse all future attempts at contact. Following the marriage, Una gave up her aspirations of being an actress in order to raise their children, of which they had 8, with the youngest being born when Chaplin was 73 and Una 37. If that doesn't put their age gap into perspective, I don't know what will. In spite of his past failed relationships and the unlikelihood of such a large age gap working out, the two remained married until Chaplin's death at age 88 in 1977. Besides his groundbreaking work in the film industry, Charlie Chaplin is most remembered for the legal issues that plagued the latter half of his life, although it's interesting to note that he was never actually punished for his very public preference of underage girls, and to this day it hardly ever factors into conversations about his lasting legacy, which you'll see as a recurring theme. With talkies revolutionizing the movie business, Hollywood was a totally different place in the 1940s than it was in the 1920s, and a new wave of actors and actresses began gracing newspaper headlines. Actor Errol Flynn first came to prominence in the mid-1930s, becoming known for his swashbuckling roles in movies like The Adventures of Robin Hood and Captain Blood. And though he often portrayed charming heartthrobs who women couldn't keep their hands off of, he was significantly less chivalrous off-screen. According to author Thomas McNulty's biography, Errol Flynn, The Life and Career, it was an open secret in Hollywood that the actor was a womanizer and creep, with his mansion having hidden peepholes, trapdoors, two-way mirrors, and speaker systems in the ladies' bathrooms. He developed a reputation for easily seducing women, which eventually led to the popularization of the expression "in like Flynn." Although his voyeuristic behavior, womanizing, frequent partying, drug and alcohol abuse, and quick temper were widely known, the actor wouldn't wind up in a courtroom until 1942, when he was accused of statutory rape by two separate teenage girls. 15-year-old Peggy Satterlee alleged that Flynn had invited her on his boat, spiked her drink, and then sexually assaulted her. 17-year-old Betty Hansen, who had just started working at Warner Brothers Studio after graduating from high school, claimed that she met Flynn for drinks and after becoming ill, was taken upstairs where she was similarly assaulted. Flynn denied the charges, claiming the girls were accusing him in the hopes of fame and fortune, something his legal counsel proceeded to use as part of their defense. Keep in mind that Errol Flynn's public image was tied to his heroic characters, and the idea that he could commit such a heinous crime was immediately denounced by not just the public, but by Hollywood studios, who saw the trial as a threat to their investment. Having become a naturalized American citizen in August 1942, even attempting to enlist in the armed services, Flynn appealed to wartime patriotism, saying in an interview, quote, "It is very strange that I am now charged with an alleged offense that supposedly took place more than a year ago. Recently, I became an American citizen and have absolute and abiding faith in American principles of justice. I am confident my innocence will be demonstrated in court beyond any doubt." As one of the biggest stars at the time, Flynn had a huge fan base made up of everyone from elementary school girls to grandmothers, and they made their support known by sending out thousands of fan letters and flocking to the courthouse en masse with words of encouragement. To them, it didn't matter that he was being accused of sexual assault. He was still the man of their dreams and their swashbuckling hero. This eventually got so out of hand that barricades were brought in to hold back crowds, and medical teams were placed on standby in case fans fainted and had to be resuscitated. Despite being teenagers, Satterlee and Hansen were given no type of protection from the press or Flynn's supporters, and their identities and faces were quickly splashed across the front page of every newspaper in the country. Flynn's female admirers weren't just cheering him on outside the courthouse, they were also part of the juror pool. With 9 women and 3 men being chosen for the task, the predominantly female jury worked to Flynn's advantage, with one publication even reporting that he was, quote, exchanging glances and smiles with the motherly ladies. The actor's legal team was forceful in their examination of the events, and out of understandable nervousness, Satterlee and Hansen stumbled during their testimony, which led many to believe that they were lying. Their prior sexual history was also brought up, with Flynn's defense alleging that they had been the instigators, and the media was quick to paint them as promiscuous villains looking to get ahead. Isn't it remarkable how little things have changed in 80 years? Meanwhile, Flynn, who was much older and accustomed to speaking to large groups of people, was incredibly composed, leading the jury to believe that his version of events was the truth, blissfully ignoring the fact that regardless of what occurred, Flynn was a 33-year-old man who decided to get drinks with a teenager. Before someone tries to comment, well, they went out with him, remember what we said earlier. Teenagers are literally less equipped to make logical decisions because their brains are still developing. We need to hold the adults responsible for allowing situations like that to occur in the first place. In February 1943, Flynn was acquitted, with the courtroom bursting into applause and his fans swarming him as he left. Shortly after the verdict was announced, Peggy Satterlee said, quote, "I knew those women on the jury would acquit him. They sat there and just looked at him adoringly, just like he was their son or something. Here I am, just 2 days from 17, and I feel like a broken old woman." While both girls had had their names dragged through the mud, the trial only bolstered Flynn's reputation as a ladies' man, and he returned to acting shortly after. I guess there's a reason why they say any publicity is good publicity. Whether or not Errol Flynn was innocent, the trial proved that the public and the media weren't concerned about protecting teenagers, even when it was obvious that they had significantly less power than the person they were going up against. Although thousands of women flooded the courthouse during the trial in the hopes of meeting Flynn, only one caught his eye, Nora Eddington. Working at the courthouse, Eddington was only 19 when she and Flynn met, and the couple married shortly after, having 2 children before divorcing in 1946. Having dealt with an assortment of health issues for decades, including a gamut of STDs as a result of his debauchery, Flynn passed away at age 50 in 1959. While you might think that this was the end of his story, in 1961, the book, The Big Love, was released, which alleged that Flynn had begun a sexual relationship with actress Beverly Adland when she was only 15, with the two starring in the film Cuban Rebel Girls together in 1959. At the time, the relationship was supported by Adland's mother, although Adland herself would later question the appropriateness of the situation.
She knew that he loved me and I loved him, and this to her was okay, and she felt this was all right, and because of the love we had for each other, that what society thought really didn't matter. My point of view, it's funny, I find myself taking my niece out, who was 15, and I look at her and I say, my God, you know, I was her age. And
you can't believe that she could possibly be in the kind of a situation that you were once in.
Definitely. Of course, she's had a different kind of upbringing, of course, but...
of course, you're growing up, too.
You know, yeah. And I look and I say, good grief. And it must have been something. I must have had something that the average 15-year-old child doesn't have. But I think back, was that really me?
Although she was only 17 when Flynn died, it was widely known that he and Adland were in a relationship, to the extent that Adland was questioned by the press on what she would be receiving in Flynn's will. Even though she attempted to branch out into other ventures, being Errol Flynn's 17-year-old girlfriend followed her throughout her life, something she abhorred.
7 years later, I think it's kind of time to just stop discussing someone that's dead. You know, if you're going to sit and
how can anybody ever think of you really without thinking of him?
Oh, I don't know. It's getting a little aggravating because, you know, after all these years, I'd like to be myself.
As the entertainment industry continued to grow, we began to see celebrities reach previously unseen levels of stardom, with Elvis Presley becoming one of the most significant figures of the entire 20th century. Although the rockabilly genre was pioneered by black musicians like Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and Little Richard, Elvis is credited for introducing the sound to white teenagers in the 1950s, successfully bringing it into the mainstream, leading him to eventually be dubbed the King of Rock and Roll. At the height of his career, Elvis could have any adult woman he wanted, but instead, he went after a 14-year-old. 24 years old at the time, Elvis was in Germany on a 2-year military stint. And upon meeting Priscilla Beaulieu in 1959 and discovering her age, he remarked, quote, "Why, you're just a baby." Of course, acknowledging the fact didn't stop him from pursuing a romantic relationship with her. With the media keeping a close eye on all of Elvis's activities abroad, their romance was publicized to the entire world, and Priscilla received multiple requests for interviews as well as mail from Elvis's fans, some positive and some negative. The two publicly dated for several months before he eventually departed Germany in March 1960 to return to the US. Although they stayed in touch, Priscilla was convinced that she would never see him again, but the two eventually reunited in 1962 when she was 17, with her parents granting her permission to fly to Los Angeles unaccompanied. They did have a few conditions, insisting that Elvis arranged for Priscilla to be chaperoned at all times and that she had to write home every single day. Although Elvis initially agreed to these simple demands, upon Priscilla's arrival in the US, Elvis told her they were going to Las Vegas, and to throw her parents off the scent, he had Priscilla write a postcard for every day they'd be away, to be mailed from Los Angeles by a member of his staff. Because Priscilla was still a minor, moving her across state lines was a huge crime, but because of his level of celebrity, it seemed as though he didn't even consider that there might be consequences. The following year, her parents allowed her to move in with Elvis permanently, leaving 18-year-old Priscilla at his beck and call, and she once admitted, quote, "He molded me into his woman. I wore the clothes, hairstyle, and makeup of his careful choosing." An entire decade older than Priscilla, with a good deal more money, there was an undeniable power imbalance that allowed him to exert control over her and make her dependent on him. Keeping her on a tight leash, Priscilla was forced to stay in Memphis while Elvis frequently traveled to California for work, where he proceeded to have affairs with his numerous co-stars, all the while denying their existence to Priscilla. A classic manipulation technique. She was occasionally allowed to visit him in Hollywood, but these trips were kept short in order to keep his affairs a secret. The two eventually married in 1966, something Elvis was allegedly pressured into doing by his manager. But with Elvis continuing to cheat on Priscilla, even after the birth of their child, the marriage soured and they separated in 1972. Despite the details of his relationship with Priscilla being public knowledge, Elvis's legacy remains untarnished. And even now, 46 years after his death, we rarely see Elvis criticized for this behavior. Even Baz Luhrmann's award-winning and critically acclaimed biopic, which claimed to chronicle the life of the rock star, completely glossed over Priscilla's age, even though it was an incredibly important aspect of their relationship that affected their entire dynamic. As one of the biggest names in rock and roll ever, and an artist many looked up to, the public's romanticization of Elvis's relationship with Priscilla unintentionally set a dangerous precedent, with many other rock stars following suit. The appallingly supportive response to Elvis's relationship with Priscilla was incredibly hypocritical, as only a few years prior to their meeting in 1959, 22-year-old musician Jerry Lee Lewis had been widely condemned for his marriage to 13-year-old Myra Gale Brown, who was also his first cousin once removed. Ironically, Lewis and Elvis were actually buddies around this time. You know what they say about birds of a feather. While I appreciate that the public had finally acknowledged a celebrity's predatory behavior and pinned the blame on the right person, the fact that this was still considered legal by the US government is incredibly disappointing. Brown would eventually give birth to their first child in 1959, when she was only 14. But besides a slight career hiccup, Lewis never got his just desserts. Even more disappointingly, in the 1970s he made a major comeback, becoming one of the most bankable country stars in the entire world. Before she became famous for her duets with Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell was in an abusive relationship with fellow singer James Brown, who was 12 years her senior. First introduced in 1960 when Terrell was 15 years old, she and Brown took their relationship public when she was 17, with Terrell signing a contract under his label and singing backup on his tours. This not only made her financially dependent on him, but also forced to accompany him wherever he went. Everyone in their circle knew that James Brown verbally and physically abused Terrell, with Otis Williams saying, quote, "When you're out on the road like we were, you hear and see things. We all knew about Tammy and James Brown. We knew how James Brown was about women, that he would flip a woman's ass. And back then, you wouldn't ever get the woman's side, so people would assume, fairly or not, he flipped her ass because she provoked him to." As a young black woman, Tammy Terrell was unable to find the help and support that she needed, both from the people around her and the law. And after ending things with Brown, she began a relationship with the Temptations' David Ruffin, who not only had a history of domestic violence, but a habit of going after girls who were significantly younger than he was. Sadly, Tammy Terrell would die at age 24 from a brain tumor, which some believe was directly complicated by the abuse that she experienced in her youth. If you're a music fan, you've probably heard the term groupie get tossed around quite a bit, usually in a derogatory manner directed at teenage girls and young women. The term itself refers to a fan who follows a particular musician or musical group in the hopes of meeting them, with a sexual agenda or not. No one is certain who coined the term. Some say a journalist created it, while others say Rolling Stones bassist Bill Wyman first used it as a code word for women on tour in the 1960s. But one thing is for sure. Once Rolling Stone magazine dedicated an entire cover story to the concept in 1969 titled "The Groupies and Other Girls," it became a rock and roll phenomenon. Numerous groupies of the 60s and 70s gained various levels of fame for their risque activities, with Cynthia Plaster-Caster, Cleo Odzer, and most notably Pamela Des Barres becoming the faces of the movement. Instead of having brief sexual encounters with the band members, these women traveled with them, even being called road wives, and not only managed the musicians' wardrobe and social lives, but served as inspiration for the music. Groupies considered themselves to be different from other fans, with Des Barres saying in an interview, quote, "A groupie is someone who loves the music so much she wants to be around the people who make it. A fan is content with an autograph or a look from the stage or a selfie. A groupie takes the next step, and that takes a lot of courage." It's still hotly debated whether a celebrity having sexual relations with a fan is exploitative or not, but wherever you stand on the matter, we should all be on the same page when it comes to minors. Although many of these women were already in their 20s by the time they began following musicians on the road, a handful were still underage and became known as baby groupies. The best-known examples were Laurie Maddox and Sable Starr, who began frequenting the clubs and bars on the Sunset Strip at ages 13 and 12, respectively. The two girls were said to have been involved with many of the biggest names of the 1970s, with Starr saying she had slept with 23-year-old punk rock star Iggy Pop when she was only 13. Because they ran in the same circles and were preyed upon by the same men, Maddox and Starr developed a rivalry, with Starr once telling Maddox, quote, "If you touch him, I will shoot you," in regard to Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, which to me really highlights how young and naive they both were. Laurie Maddox and Jimmy Page first began dating when she was 13 and he was 28. Although Page and his management went to great lengths to keep the relationship a secret due to the possibility of being arrested for statutory rape, there is still a good amount of documentation that proves it occurred. For the first year of their relationship, Maddox was kept in a locked hotel room with a security guard to ensure that she wouldn't be seen. And it wasn't until 1975, when she was 15, that he became more willing to be seen in public with her. Bizarrely, her mother actually consented to the relationship and often compared her daughter to Priscilla Presley, proving just how much of a domino effect that relationship had. Maddox later claimed that she dumped Page when she was 16 after finding him in bed with fellow baby groupie Bebe Buell, who was also 16 at the time. Buell had first entered the scene at 15, where she became involved with many of the same men who were sexually involved with both Maddox and Starr, including Mick Jagger, Iggy Pop, and David Bowie. Many artists publicly boasted about their wild escapades with groupies of all ages, in some cases even writing songs about them. In Iggy Pop's 1996 song, Look Away, the singer memorialized his time with Starr. Quote, "I slept with Sable when she was 13. Her parents were too rich to do anything. She rocked her way around LA till a New York doll carried her away." Imagine being so sure that you weren't going to be punished for a crime to admit to it in a song. During this era, no one batted an eye when they saw a rock star leave the club with a young girl, including the girls themselves. They were groomed into believing that they had control, that they were consenting to these relationships, when in reality, they were just kids who were being manipulated and coerced into being passed around by grown adults. Unfortunately, many groupies of the 70s are still unable to accept that they were taken advantage of. When asked about her time as a baby groupie in 2015, Laurie Maddox said in an interview, quote, "I feel like I was protected rather than exploited. I didn't think of myself as underage. I was a model. I was in love. That time of my life was so much fun. It was a period in which everything seemed possible. Nobody was afraid of winding up on YouTube or TMZ. Now people are terrified. You can't even walk out your door without being photographed. It's become a different world. But I should add, things haven't really changed. Look at the Kylie and Kendall Jenners, the Gigi Hadids. They're the modern-day versions of teenage groupies. The only difference is that the internet blows them up in a way that allows them to make a fortune. And then there's Lindsay Lohan, Paris Hilton, and all those kids who are partying at 15. It's just a different era. It's evolved into something else. I look back very fondly on those years. I was really special. Who cares what people said about me? I got to hang out with some of the most amazing, most beautiful, most charismatic men in the world. I went to concerts in limos with police escorts. Am I going to regret this? No. Pamela DeBar shared a similar sentiment in regard to Maddox's time as a groupie. Quote, "She wasn't abused because that's what she wanted. Yeah, she was young, and nowadays 15 isn't what it used to be, and prior to that era, 15 wasn't what it became. It was just a period in time when things like that happened and it was okay. It was a short period in time, but it was our reality, and everyone was okay with it. It's unfortunate that this has to be said, but just because something is normalized, that doesn't make it okay. Denial is a natural trauma response, so I completely understand and empathize with all of the women who are unable to come to terms with what happened to them in their youth. What I don't think is acceptable is the romanticization of the situation, especially by the press. Even in more recent years, the sexual exploitation of young women in the 1970s has been glamorized, with Far Out magazine publishing an article in 2020 which referred to Sable Starr as Queen of the Groupies, dubbing her a sex symbol who had, quote, "every rock star wrapped around her finger." Just as a reminder, Starr was only 13 when these men first began preying on her. That should absolutely not be reframed as a sexually liberating experience. In more recent years, Laurie Maddox has reevaluated her stance on the matter. Quote, "I never thought there was anything wrong with it, but maybe there was. I used to get letters telling me he was a pedophile, but I'd never think of him like that. He never abused me, ever. I don't think underage girls should sleep with guys. I wouldn't want this for anybody's daughter. My perspective is changing as I get older and more cynical. Plenty of musicians attempted to take advantage of the lax rules of the era, some more successfully than others. Ted Nugent famously sparked backlash when he released the song Jailbait in 1981, which is about wanting to have sex with a 13-year-old, which wasn't too far off from the age of his real wife at the time, Pele Massa. Nugent had begun a relationship with a native Hawaiian in 1978, which was technically legal because the age of consent in Hawaii at the time was only 14, but they weren't allowed to marry because of their 13-year age gap. To get around this, Nugent had Massa's parents sign documents which made him her legal guardian, thereby allowing him to give himself consent to marry her. This not only showed just how easy it was to exploit the legal system, but also mirrored the abuse that Indigenous women are often subjected to because of the incompetence of the US government. Nugent would also admit to having several affairs with underage girls in an episode of Behind the Music, where he said, quote,
I mean, I was addicted to girls. Addicted. It was hopeless. It was beautiful. I got the stamp of approval of their parents. Because they figured better Ted Nugent than some drug-infested punk in high school.
He would later deny the statement. Another rock star with a knack for finding legal loopholes was Aerosmith singer Steven Tyler, who also dated Bebe Buell when she was in her teens. In a report from Rolling Stone, Tyler's former girlfriend, Julia Holcomb, filed a lawsuit in 2022 that alleged that Tyler had sexually abused her in 1973 when she was just 16 years old. Also in the report, Holcomb alleges that when the pair first began dating, with Tyler age 25 and Holcomb 16, Tyler convinced Holcomb's mother to pass over guardianship of her daughter so he could give himself legal permission to date her. The lawsuit quotes from the singer's 1997 memoir where he said that Holcomb's parents, quote, signed a paper over for me to have custody, so I wouldn't get arrested if I took her out of state. Tyler goes on to say in the book, quote, she was 16. She knew how to nasty, and there wasn't a hair on it. With my bad self being 26 and she barely old enough to drive and sexy as hell, I just fell madly in love with her. She was my heart's desire, my partner in crimes of passion. This was definitely a crime, but I wouldn't call it a partnership. In 1977, director Roman Polanski was arrested and charged with drugging and raping 13-year-old Samantha Gailey. At his arraignment, he pled not guilty to all charges, and many executives in Hollywood came to his defense, once again showing how the industry tends to side with the villain rather than the victim. As a result of a plea bargain, he pled guilty to the lesser offense of unlawful sex with a minor in 1978, but after learning that the judge planned to reject his plea deal and impose a prison term instead of probation, Polanski fled to Paris, where he couldn't be extradited. In the decades since, a number of other women have accused Polanski of assaulting them when they were underage, but in spite of all of this, Polanski continues to direct movies, win awards, and walk red carpets, proving how far the film industry is willing to go to protect predators. We couldn't talk about how messed up things were for young girls in the 1970s without mentioning Brooke Shields. First rising to prominence following the release of the 1978 film Pretty Baby, where she played a child who was forced into prostitution, Shields was quickly sexualized by the public and the media, with one outlet even referring to her as a, quote, sultry mix of an all-American virgin and whore. I wouldn't suggest making that sort of compliment to anyone, let alone a 12-year-old. Like many of the people we've talked about thus far, Shields' continuous exploitation was approved of by her parents, with her mother, Terry, not only supporting the sexualization of her child, but directly causing it in some cases, as seen in 1975 when she signed off on 10-year-old Brooke Shields posing nude, with makeup, and covered in oil for Playboy. Although her mother, the photographer, and Playboy were brought to court in the early 1980s because of the photos, it was ruled in their favor because of yet another legal loophole. At age 14, Brooke Shields would star in the 1980 film The Blue Lagoon, appearing topless but with her hair strategically covering her chest. And in 1981's Endless Love, she appeared nude. Despite this clearly breaking the law, Shields was the only one who was blamed, not the filmmakers, and she was regularly criticized for her promotion of supposedly promiscuous behavior. Because the sexualization of Brooke Shields was so normalized, she spent years struggling with her feelings on the matter, and often denied that there was anything wrong with it. It's only in more recent years that she's spoken up about the abuse, saying in a recent interview with Drew Barrymore, quote,
"Because I didn't know where I fell on the spectrum of it. Like, I don't know where to interpret my experiences, because I was made to feel culpable, and by the same time, you know, you victim shame yourself."
Although all of the examples we've discussed thus far involve older men and young girls, that doesn't mean that the opposite doesn't occur. In August 1987, Patrick Dempsey married his 48-year-old manager and acting coach, Rochelle Parker, who was 27 years his senior. The pair first met on the set of the 1986 theater production Brighton Beach Memoirs when Dempsey was 18, and the relationship raised eyebrows, especially after it was publicized that Parker was also the mother of Dempsey's best friend. The marriage eventually ended after 7 years following a messy divorce, which involved allegations of abuse and alcoholism. When reflecting on the relationship in 2006, Dempsey said, quote, "I think I needed a mother. There were a lot of negative things that I'm still undoing from it." This lack of a supportive and protective parental figure is consistent in many of the unhealthy age gap relationships we've discussed so far. With tabloids thriving in the 90s, everyone had something to say about the latest celebrity pairing, and you weren't anyone in Hollywood unless people were talking about who you were dating. While some of these relationships were short-lived flings and others long-lasting love affairs, a surprising number were outright inappropriate. Before he was linked to Gwyneth Paltrow, Jennifer Aniston, or Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt spent the early part of his career dating much younger girls. In 1987, 24-year-old Pitt shared his first on-screen kiss with 15-year-old Chyenne Nicole on the TV show Dallas. While it's strange enough that he was cast to play a high schooler's boyfriend, what's even weirder is that they actually began dating in real life, although this romance did wind up being rather short-lived. In 1990, Pitt met actress Juliette Lewis on the set of the TV film Too Young to Die, where she played a 15-year-old exotic dancer and he was her older lover. Despite this film and 1993's California depicting their age gap as predatory and exploitative, the toxic on-screen romance soon turned into a real-life relationship, and the two dated for 3 years, starting when Lewis was 16 and Pitt was 26. Years later, after Pitt had skyrocketed to stardom, Lewis said in an interview with The Guardian, quote, "He's not in my universe at all now. It seems like a high school relationship because now he's a very famous person." Isn't it interesting that she says it seems like a high school relationship when she literally was a high schooler? But I guess when your partner is almost 30, that can be hard to remember. In 1993, then 38-year-old actor and comedian Jerry Seinfeld met 17-year-old high school senior Shoshana Lonstein in Central Park, where the two struck up a conversation and she gave him her phone number. According to Seinfeld, he claimed her age never came up in their first conversation. It was just an innocent case of acquaintance making. However, from appearance alone, it's fairly obvious that she wasn't anywhere near his age. So was he just acting oblivious? When radio personality Howard Stern seemed to poke fun at the couple's age gap in an interview, Seinfeld insisted that she was, quote, "definitely not 17, only to reappear on the show a month later to try and clarify the situation by saying, quote, "I didn't realize she was so young." After Lonstein turned 18, they officially began dating, but Seinfeld stated that she never told him her age until the tabloids got wind of their relationship, an attempt to pin the blame on her instead of himself. The 21-year age gap drew attention and scrutiny from the media, with Seinfeld saying in an interview in 1994, quote, "Shoshana is a person, not an age. She is extremely bright. She's funny, sharp, very alert. We just get along. You can hear the click." If you're clicking with a teenager, it says a lot more about your maturity and intelligence than it does theirs.
Seinfeld's girl is 17 and innocent with double D's. He saw those breasts and flipped his lid for a real young busty high school kid.
In interviews, Seinfeld mentioned the mixed reactions he received from acquaintances when news about the relationship broke. Quote, "It's really strange. The reactions ran the absolute gamut, from horrified to just busting buttons with pride that they know me. Guys I hadn't heard from in years called to say, 'Congratulations, good for you.' Women I know wouldn't even call me back. My assistant punched me. She saw me and literally punched me. She was so mad." It doesn't surprise me that the women in his life were more appalled at the situation, as they weren't clouded by a midlife crisis fantasy. Seinfeld was completely unbothered by the criticisms directed at this relationship, and even cracked jokes about Lonstein's age in interviews, saying, quote, "The great thing is you can go out on a date and pick up a little babysitting money on the side. That pays for the pizza. If you can joke about being your date's babysitter, then maybe it's time to reevaluate who you're dating." Gothic rock musician Marilyn Manson has had multiple sexual assault and abuse allegations in the last few years, most recently in January 2023, when a woman anonymously referred to as Jane Doe filed a lawsuit against Manson that included counts of sexual battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress, amongst other charges. According to the suit's coverage in Rolling Stone, quote, Doe says she first encountered Manson in 1995 after a Dallas concert when she was age 16. She waited outside his tour bus with a group of people to meet him, and he allegedly invited her and one of the other younger girls onto his bus, where he asked their age and school grade and took down their home addresses and phone numbers. While on the tour bus, Manson performed various acts of criminal sexual conduct upon Jane Doe, who was a virgin at the time. One of the band members watched Manson sexually assault Jane Doe. After he was done, Manson laughed at her and threatened that if she told anyone, he would kill her and her family. The suit claims Marilyn Manson not only introduced and enabled the girl's eventual drug and alcohol abuse, but continually perpetuated his methods of grooming, manipulation, and sexual assault. The suit also alleges that Manson's bandmates and label executives were well aware of the situation, but did nothing to prevent it. Many other women have shared similar stories about Manson's psychological and sexual abuse, with actress Evan Rachel Wood revealing in February 2021 that the musician had groomed her as a teenager, saying that she was, quote, brainwashed and manipulated into submission throughout their on and off relationship. Much like Errol Flynn nearly 8 decades earlier, Manson received huge waves of support from his female fans, while Wood was painted as a villain across the internet. Speaking of famous swashbucklers, actor Johnny Depp, who interestingly enough is best buddies with Marilyn Manson, also made headlines for dating teenagers. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Depp dated an assortment of famous women, and while his relationships were always considered headline-worthy, it was the 4-year relationship with his Edward Scissorhands co-star Winona Ryder that caused the most buzz. Ryder and Depp first met in June 1989 at the premiere of Great Balls of Fire, a movie that is ironically enough about Jerry Lee Lewis. Ryder was 17 at the time, while Depp was 26, and they began dating 2 months later. Shortly after Ryder reached the legal age of consent, and only 5 months after they'd started dating, the pair announced their engagement. This was Depp's 3rd engagement following Sherilyn Fenn and Jennifer Grey, having proposed to the latter only 2 weeks after they'd started dating. Although Ryder's parents approved of the relationship, her father drew the line at marriage, asking the couple to wait a few years before tying the knot, which was likely for the best, as Ryder was still just a teenager. In an interview with Elle UK, Ryder recalled all of the firsts she experienced with Depp. Quote, "He was my first everything. My first real kiss, my first real boyfriend, my first fiancé, the first guy I had sex with. And in 1993, he also became her first heartbreak." Teenage romances are tough enough as is, but imagine how much more difficult the situation becomes when the person you're dating is not only famous, but is also significantly older than you are. Whether intentional or not, the adolescent mind can and often is persuaded into believing that the older person in the relationship is the only one who understands them. And in the event of a breakup, the younger person often blames themselves, which can result in the continuation of the cycle. One of the only celebrities to face serious legal consequences for his actions is R. Kelly, whose long list of sexual abuse dates all the way back to the 90s. Because of the scope and extent of these crimes, we can't even begin to get into all of them, so we'll instead be focusing on one of his first scandals. In 1994, Kelly secretly married R&B singer Aaliyah when she was only 15 and he was 27. The two had first been introduced to each other by Aaliyah's uncle, record producer Barry Hankerson, when she was 12 years old. The two became close and worked together on Aaliyah's debut album, Age Ain't Nothin' But a Number, with R. Kelly serving as both writer and producer. The title of the album is significantly more troubling in hindsight. Although he and Aaliyah initially denied that their relationship was anything other than professional, one of R. Kelly's former dancers testified that she had witnessed sexual contact between the two when Aaliyah was only 13. And considering what we now know about R. Kelly, it wouldn't have been out of character. Their marriage was eventually annulled in February 1995 at the behest of Aaliyah's family. And in 1997, after splitting with Kelly, Aaliyah filed a lawsuit to have the marriage record expunged, as she was underage at the time and couldn't legally enter into marriage without parental consent. Throughout R. Kelly's career, he was frequently brought to court over his sexual misconduct towards underage girls. But in spite of this, the music industry continued to provide him with a platform which gave him access to minors.
Do you like teenage girls?
When you say teenage, how are we talking?
Even after his arrest, executives at multiple record companies exhibited relaxed attitudes about his behavior and refused to comment on their role in his abuse, while also insisting that there was nothing wrong with them continuing to profit off of his music. This is where the main problem lies. There are way too many people in the industry who are comfortable with protecting sexual abuse, whether it's to benefit themselves or to avoid the consequences of being the one who snitched. It's also very telling that for nearly 30 years, even R. Kelly's own fans made jokes about the sexual abuse allegations, only turning on him after the evidence was undeniable, proving that even when victims attempt to come forward, they're rarely ever listened to. And even when justice is served, it isn't until after countless others have been negatively affected. Like many heartthrobs of the 90s, Leonardo DiCaprio got around, and while the press and the public were always interested in his relationships, it's now become a running joke.
Leonardo DiCaprio, what can I even say about him? He's done so much to fight climate change and leave behind a cleaner, greener planet for his girlfriends.
26 is a weird age in Hollywood. I mean, you're young enough to play a high school student, but you're too old to date Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio attended the premiere, and by the end, his date was too old for him.
A serial dater, DiCaprio has been in several long-term relationships since the early 2000s, but it wasn't until more recently that people have picked up on the actor's habit of dating newly legal women, then replacing them with younger models the second they turn 25. One of DiCaprio's first public relationships was with Brazilian model Gisele Bündchen. The couple were first linked in 1999 when DiCaprio was 25 and Bündchen was 19. Although this is already a pretty extreme difference, this wound up being the smallest age gap between DiCaprio and his partner. After the couple broke up in 2005, he's since been romantically linked with Bar Raffaelli, Blake Lively, Aaron Heatherton, Nina Agdal, and Camilla Morrone, who have a median age of 22. He met his most recent ex, Morrone, when she was only 12 years old, with Al Pacino, who was dating her mother, introducing the two. Although DiCaprio was referred to as a family friend, he eventually crossed the line and began dating Morrone shortly after she turned 19. The two stayed together for 5 years, coincidentally breaking up a few short months after she had turned 25. Isn't it interesting that the second these women's brains reach maturity, he's suddenly no longer interested? Over the last few years, Leo's dating preferences have become such public knowledge that both the media and Hollywood have turned it into a running joke. He's tarnished his own reputation to the point that anytime he's spotted in the vicinity of a young girl, people are quick to proclaim her his latest girlfriend. DiCaprio is allegedly displeased at the jokes currently being made at his expense, and while I can somewhat understand his frustrations, if every woman you've been spotted with for the past decade has been in their very early 20s, can you really blame everyone for assuming that your next partner might be a similar age? Also, if you were really that upset by the way the public currently perceives him, why not make a conscious effort to date someone closer to his age? While DiCaprio's most recent relationship with 27-year-old Gigi Hadid succeeds in debunking the rumors that he refuses to date women over 25, it's still laughable how much younger she is than him. It's like he thinks he'll die if he talks to a woman in her 40s. If he keeps dating the way he is, soon enough the age gap between him and his partner will be older than they are. When you bring up Leonardo DiCaprio's troubling dating history, people are quick to deflect by saying, well, what about Kris Jenner and her 42-year-old boyfriend? Hopefully at this point we can all agree that minors should be off limits and that dating legal teenagers might not be the most ethical thing in the world. But once people turn 20 is when things get a bit more complicated. Human existence isn't so simple that your entire life can be separated by childhood and adulthood. There are multiple stages which are dictated by your physical changes, intelligence, experiences, and surroundings. When we're younger, the differences between these stages is more obvious. Just look at a toddler and a teenager. And although these differences become more subtle as we continue to age, that doesn't make them non-existent. Even if a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old are both adults, they're in vastly different life stages, which can be reflected in their maturity, education, or finances, all of which can have a profound effect on the power balance in a relationship. Comparatively, a 40-year-old and a 60-year-old are going to have a lot more in common. Madonna has never shied away from her sexuality, but the now 64-year-old singer also has a habit of dating people significantly younger than she is. Following her 2008 divorce from Guy Ritchie, who was 10 years younger, the singer has dated an assortment of men who were at minimum 28 years her junior. Her latest beau, model Andrew Darnell, is 41 years younger than she is, and at only 23 years old, he's old enough to be her son, literally, as Madonna's oldest child is 25. In an interview with The Post, an anonymous friend of the singer attributed her dating habits to her ego, saying, quote, "She likes the idea of a guy being younger than her daughter. It announces her desirability to the world. Some people may see her as a vampire, feeding off of the young, but in her mind, she's forever youthful, and this helps to prove it." Although Madonna's dating patterns mirror that of Leo DiCaprio's, though she's nearly 2 decades older, she doesn't receive half the amount of backlash or media attention. In fact, some have even praised her for pulling younger men. Again, just because a relationship is legal or even consensual, that doesn't mean that there isn't a power imbalance.
What's the youngest boy you've ever dated?
I mean, it depends on, like, how old. Because I was going to say, when I moved to New York, I dated a 16-year-old, but
that was when you were, like, 18.
Yeah. No, the youngest was, in the last 6 years, 22, yeah.
The 2000s were wrought with the sexualization of minors, with some of the most famous celebrities of the decade being publicly preyed upon by adults and then subsequently shamed for it. While filming Dark Angel in January 2000, 19-year-old Jessica Alba entered a relationship with her 31-year-old co-star Michael Weatherly. On her 20th birthday, Weatherly proposed, and although her parents disapproved, Alba accepted, something she later regretted, saying in 2007, quote, "I don't know why I got engaged. I was a virgin. He was 12 years older than me." Alba's parents were deeply religious, something cited as their reason for disapproving of Weatherly. But Alba herself had a complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, in large part because of how they reacted to her sexualization as a teenager. Quote, "Older men would hit on me, and my youth pastor said it was because I was wearing provocative clothing when I wasn't. It just made me feel like if I was in any way desirable to the opposite sex, that it was my fault, and it made me ashamed of my body and being a woman." Regardless of what she was wearing, a child should never be held responsible for the actions of adult men. They are the problem. Because she was so often depicted on screen in a sexualized manner, the public saw her as grown, when in reality, she was closer in age to a 10-year-old than she was to her fiancé, although as per usual, this was rarely pointed out by the press. Megan Fox was similarly over-sexualized by both the media and the industry. Although she started her career in age-appropriate, lighthearted comedies like Holiday in the Sun and Confessions of a Teenage Drama Queen, by 2004, Fox's physical appearance had led to her being typecast as a sexed-up teenager, as evidenced by her role in 2.5 Men, and later, Transformers. At age 18, Fox met fellow actor Brian Austin Green on the set of Hope and Faith, who at the time was 30 years old. According to Fox, Green was initially hesitant to enter a relationship because of their age difference, stating, quote, "I had to convince him that I was slightly more responsible and well-spoken and had other things to bring to the table besides being 18. When speaking about the early days of their relationship, Green said, quote, "I met Megan on Hope and Faith, and she was really young, and I was like, this can't fucking happen. This isn't going to happen. No way. And so I left, and she was just really persistent. And thank God." Regardless of whether or not the younger person is actively pursuing the older one, it's the responsibility of the adult to know when to set clear boundaries and tell them no. As we've said, adolescents think emotionally, not logically, and humoring any sort of inappropriate flirtation could be interpreted as interest, which can put you both in a difficult situation. When adults pursue teenagers, they often say something along the lines of, "Oh, they're mature for their age," in an attempt to make the situation seem less predatory. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how mature they act, it's all a facade, and they simply do not have the valuable life experiences that come with age. This is actually a technique used by some abusers as a way of providing the younger person with a false sense of control, and makes it more difficult for them to recognize the power imbalances at play. This can be even more complicated in the entertainment industry, where kids spend most of their time surrounded by adults instead of people their own age, which leads them to believe that they're wiser than their years. Compared to many of her contemporaries, Hilary Duff was seen as the golden girl of young Hollywood, having been the poster child for Disney and remaining relatively scandal-free throughout the early 2000s. As a result, it was rather shocking when in 2004, at the age of 16, it was revealed that she had begun dating Good Charlotte singer Joel Madden.
Actually, I do chores. I have to take the trash out and make sure my room is clean and feed the dog and do stuff like that, do the dishes.
The couple would only date for 2 years, but Duff would later imply that she had lost her virginity to Madden during that time. Considering he was 9 years older than she was, that would have been a crime. But of course, no one ever did anything about it.
Anything special you did for your girl? I mean, it's a big birthday to remember.
I threw her a little surprise party. I brought her home and I had a cake and balloons, and it was just me and her.
A similar situation occurred with Mandy Moore, who began dating actor Wilmer Valderrama when she was around 16. The actor, who was 20 at the time, would later have the nerve to claim that he had taken Moore's virginity, saying in an interview, quote, "The sex with Mandy was good, but it wasn't like warm apple pie." Besides being a complete asshole move, how stupid do you have to be to admit to having sex with a minor? Moore would later deny that she and Valderrama had sexual relations, while also expressing shock at his statements.
No, well, see, we were each other's first loves. You know what I mean? That's
took an hour.
She was a virgin. Got her virginity. She was a virgin. You took her virginity,
dude.
High five! High five, Artie.
Come here.
Okay.
Unsurprisingly, this wasn't the only teenager that Valderrama publicly dated. He continued the pattern in 2004 when he began dating Lindsay Lohan, who was 18 when he was 24, and he then followed up that relationship with Demi Lovato, who was 17 when they met. Valderrama would later claim that they didn't actually become romantically involved until after Lovato reached the age of consent. But considering he was already 29 years old at the time, what was he doing waiting around for a teenager to become legal? Lovato would later release the song 29 about the relationship, with the lyrics calling out Valderrama's habit of teen dating and Lovato's newfound understanding of the power imbalance. Demi Lovato and Hilary Duff were far from the only Disney darlings to date significantly older men, with 15-year-old Miley Cyrus entering a relationship with underwear model Justin Gaston in 2008, who was 20 at the time. With Cyrus receiving more negative press in general around this time period, the relationship did see some concern and scrutiny regarding the age difference, which she would frequently brush off in interviews.
And, hey, let's talk about your boyfriend. No, there's all kinds of, he's your boyfriend, he's not your boyfriend. It seems like he's your boyfriend.
I can see where you could see that.
Yeah,
I could see that.
Yeah, we could all see that.
Yeah.
His name is Justin?
Yeah.
Right. And he seems very sweet. So he's your boyfriend?
No, I giggle about everyone.
Both families approved of the pairing at the time, with Gaston even working with Billy Ray Cyrus. Although maybe what he thought doesn't really matter, considering the 61-year-old is currently engaged to a 20-something-year-old girl he first met when she was a teenager on the set of Hannah Montana. One age gap relationship from the 2000s that has come back into the public eye is Taylor Swift and John Mayer, who were first linked back in 2009 when Swift was 19 and Mayer was 32. Whether you're a fan of either musician or not, you're sure to have heard about this drama, both when it first unfolded in 2010 and when it came back into the spotlight in the 2020s. Often drawing from her real-life experiences, Swift wrote a song titled Dear John for her 2010 album Speak Now, which had lyrics that highlighted how young and naive she was in comparison to the much older musician. Mayer would later reveal that he felt humiliated by the song, saying, quote, "I never got an email, I never got a phone call. I was really caught off guard, and it really humiliated me at a time when I'd already been dressed down. I mean, how would you feel if at the lowest you've ever been, someone kicked you even lower?" After playing this woe is me card, Mayer would later be asked about their age difference, but declined to comment. Although this list has been dominated by adult men, that obviously doesn't mean that grown women aren't exhibiting the same predatory dating habits. Actor Aaron Taylor Johnson first met his eventual wife, Sam Johnson, in 2009 on the set of Nowhere Boy. Aaron was around 19 at the time, while Sam was 42. The couple would later announce their engagement at the premiere of Nowhere Boy, mere months after they had started dating, and the following year they would welcome their first child together. In 2012, the couple would welcome their second child and finally get married, meaning that at the age of 22, Aaron was a father of 4, as Sam had 2 other children from a previous marriage, with her eldest daughter being only 7 years younger than Aaron. Besides the significant age gap potentially causing a power imbalance, it's also concerning to know that Sam was effectively his boss when they first met. Imagine something like that happening at any other job. It'd cause a huge shitstorm. Likely as a direct result of the frequent criticisms they received online, the couple is deliberately private about their relationship. But in the rare interviews they have given, there are some troubling statements, like only having spent a handful of days apart throughout their entire relationship, which could potentially be a sign of codependency. Although the sexualization of teen girls is more rampant in the entertainment industry, that's not to say that the opposite doesn't happen, with Justin Bieber being a notable example. At only 15, Bieber quickly discovered that fame was a double-edged sword. Although girls and women adored him, other boys, and especially grown men, frequently ridiculed his entire existence. And throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, he became the entertainment industry's punching bag. Because the public was so accustomed to Justin Bieber being fawned over, while also being the butt of the joke, that even when undeniably inappropriate situations occurred on camera, nothing was done about it. This included 39-year-old Jenny McCarthy kissing his neck and grabbing his butt on national television when he was 18. And after receiving no flack for her actions, she later said, quote, "I kind of molested him."
Wow! I feel violated right now.
The grown female host of the talk also asked him inappropriate questions like which one of us would you date, and would you perform naked on stage, when he was only 17. And even though Bieber voiced that he was uncomfortable, he was ignored. While we've seen people like Charlie Chaplin and Ted Nugent use the law to help them break the law, such flagrant abuse of the legal system isn't as common today, apart from one notable exception. In 2011, 16-year-old Courtney Stodden became the topic of conversation after marrying 51-year-old actor Doug Hutchinson, who was quickly labeled a pedophile and predator by the press and the public.
What can a 51-year-old man see in a 16-year-old girl?
Their forbidden marriage made headlines.
Where's the connection here? Emotionally? Psychologically?
The couple first met after Stodden had signed up for an acting workshop, and the two later began an online courtship that lasted several months, although Hutchinson claimed that he was unaware that Stodden was a minor. After learning Stodden's actual age, he asked Stodden's parents for approval to continue dating, which they granted, eventually leading to their marriage. Although Hutchinson was criticized by the public, Stodden was equally condemned, in large part because of their appearance, which was deemed provocative and trashy. Around the same time, reality shows like 16 and Pregnant and Teen Mom were airing. It's worth pointing out that in these shows, the couples were made up of teenagers, yet they were widely criticized for their poor decisions and deemed too irresponsible to be parents. Yet, at the very same time, the public and the press was punishing Courtney Stodden for their part in the marriage and for their looks, instead of acknowledging that they were a child who was manipulated into a legally binding relationship by a man 3 times their age. The two wound up breaking up and reconciling for several years, with both attributing the strain on their marriage to their age difference. But it wasn't until 2020 that a divorce was finalized, with Stodden saying that they felt absolutely taken advantage of and groomed. Although Paul Walker, best known for his role in the Fast and Furious franchise, tragically passed away in 2013, that shouldn't give him a pass when it comes to his predatory dating habits, especially when documentaries about his life have attempted to gloss over the matter in order to preserve his legacy. At the time of his death, Walker was dating and living with Jasmine Pilchard Gosnell, who was 23 at the time, but it was later revealed that the two had begun dating when she was 16 and he was 33. Prior to this, Walker had dated Aubriana Atwell, who was allegedly also in her teens when the two first met. Although there's no concrete evidence that Walker had sexual relations with these girls while they were minors, it does make me wonder why his dating history is so rarely discussed by his friends, family, or fans. Say what you will about the Kardashian-Jenner clan, but the fact that 25-year-old Tyga had set his eyes on Kylie Jenner before she had even turned 17, and no one did anything about it, is a bit troubling to say the least. Although they were frequently spotted together throughout 2014, with Tyga even breaking up with his then fiancée Blac Chyna for Kylie, it wasn't until Kylie turned 18 that they publicly announced that they were dating. Interesting how that timing works out, They eventually broke up in 2017 when Kylie turned 20, and she hasn't commented on the relationship or their age difference since, but I do wonder how she feels about the matter now as a mother. While it feels like times have changed for the better, there are still countless examples of famous adults dating teenagers. Comedian Dane Cook, who I've always despised, recently announced his engagement to Kelsey Taylor, who is 26 years his junior, something which was widely joked about on the internet. The pair allegedly met at a game night at Cook's house in 2018 when Taylor was only 17, but claimed that they didn't begin dating until she was 18. Even if an 18-year-old is legally an adult, mentally, physically, and emotionally, there's no difference between them and a 17-year-old. So if you're pursuing a teenager because you can, you're admitting that the law is the only thing keeping you in check, instead of, your moral or ethical values. It's like saying you'd be murdering people if it weren't legal. It's this type of semantics that have allowed people to take advantage of children in countries with even lower ages of consent. I'm sure some people will say that it's unfair to shame people for their preferences, but when said preferences have been used for more harm than good, that's a problem. Many people use the words and actions of celebrities to justify their own behavior, and if the most famous people in the world are applauded for dating someone who's fresh out of high school, then it's no surprise that the general public are leading by example. Seeing a middle-aged man making out with a teenage girl is by no means a strange occurrence, but maybe it should be. As history has proven, it's only when we begin to actively speak out against these sorts of things that we'll start to see any changes. What are some other celebrities that you can think of who have problematic dating histories? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!